Okay, alright, so I feel like a bit of a sheep among the wolves here because I'm not actually a mobile developer and this isn't really about mobile development. Yes. But I've got 2 photos of mobile apps in it, so look out for those. Basically I was asked to come and give this as a talk. I gave a conference that my work does every year. They've only done it once. And we're kind of encouraged to just talk about anything that we want for a whole day, and this is what I decided to talk about. If you've seen Silicon Valley, a TV show, it's a little bit like that. It's a little bit of a 13-month reflection on, a reflection on a 13-month period of my life that I thought was kind of interesting to talk about because we all work in various kinds of different companies. So this all happens just before I moved to Bristol, and it kind of tells a story about a time whenever my job was a firmware engineer and my hobby as a homebrewer kind of just like smashed headlong into each other. And you'll notice the hero's journey subtitle. If anybody doesn't know what the hero's journey is, it was kind of it's like an archetypal kind of framework for writing adventure stories, and it was popularized in the 40s in a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I just thought that was really funny to kind of try and map this journey on top of that. And it might be a little bit more fun, just for a little bit of interactivity, just so I know who I'm working with here. Show of hands, okay? Who knows what beer is? Show of hands. That's good, I'm glad. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Keep your hand up if you actually know how beer is made. Okay, and then keep your hand up if you've actually made beer before. Oh, Jesus. We got 1, 2, we got one, that's good. Alright. Okay. So here we are, it's the ordinary world. It's mid-2014 to be precise. At this point in my life, I'm working for a really small firmware company just outside Belfast, and I'm writing sensor code for fuel level sensors in this new version of cars that Volkswagen were making. And I had it all. It actually was it actually was involved in that, but let's not go down that road. I had it all, quite frankly. I had the chinos, I had the tucked in shirt, I had the cubicle, and I even had the clock in card. And we can all laugh, but I was pretty green. I was just out of university, and this is really good sort of teething ground for me. This is where I learned how to write C. It's where I learned how to talk to customers, send emails, go to meetings, all that stuff that no one teaches you whenever you're at university. And I learned how to make products for manufacture and for high volume manufacture as well. And while this is all happening, I started homebrewing, and I started simply as a graduate who just wanted to get drunk on the cheap. So we started in a local hacker space, believe it or not, and they gave us a corner of the workshop, and we kind of just started hacking on beer. And then we started off with 2 buckets and some saucepans and an off-the-shelf recipe kit, and we quickly progressed onto an all-grain system, and we were brewing on a self-welded frame with 2 modified 80s beer kegs running through a hacked immersion heater system, and that was all wired together using cheap Chinese PID controllers and loads of dirty electronics. And if anyone here does any electronics, you might notice this photo on the very left. That's actually some mains cables held together with duct tape, all attached to a Raspberry Pi with a custom PCB on the wall. But you gotta think about, like, you're a software developer. We were defining our process and we were trying to work out how to get it right. Okay, you gotta stick it together before you get it right. So I was kind of like a dormant force at that point. I was kind of ready to be disrupted a little bit. And basically I'd noticed this company in Belfast called Brewbot. They'd popped up on Kickstarter. And basically they were a bunch of young guys who had been sort of semi-successfully running an iOS consultancy firm. And they were winding that down to get into IoT hardware. And basically the best part about that was they were proposing to build a fully automated and connected home brewery that was fully controllable and monitored using a smartphone app. So they actually went on to raise 114% of their goal on Kickstarter, and they immediately started making waves in all sorts of really good press. And they'd been rumoured to have lots and lots of VC money headed their way. So what are they actually doing? Well, this is the kind of point where this guy will probably sort of pick me up on a few mistakes, but I gotta give you a really simple primer on how you actually make beer. So any brewery, big or small, is basically going to be made up of these 4 vessels, okay? You've got a hot water tank, you've got a mash tun, a boil kettle, and a fermentation vessel, okay? And basically first things first, you're going to depending on what recipe you're making, of course, you're going to add a very precise amount of grains and sugar into the middle vessel, the mash tun. Then you're going to heat a very precise amount of water at a very precise temperature in the hot water tank. And then that gets mixed in with all the grains and the sugar, and that gets left to rest at a precise temperature for a precise time of about 60 to 90 minutes. Then you heat some more liquid, again, very precise amount of liquid, heat it to a very precise temperature, and then basically you allow that liquid to filter in on top of the mash tun while the liquid filters out of the mash tun, so you create like an equilibrium flow, and basically that runs for about an hour until you basically have this really thick sugary liquid in the boil kettle. You apply some heat, you get that up to a boil, add a lot of hops, and then basically you transfer that while cooling very quickly, add some yeast, the yeast eats the sugar, makes the ethanol, among other things, and then that's where the alcohol in beer comes from. You carbonate it, you bottle it, you drink it. So in very basic terms, that's what Brewbot we're trying to do, all just inside this very nice piece of industrial design. And meaning that any individual could buy this, put it in their garage, their kitchen, their house, whatever, plug it into the mains, minimal interaction. They could download a recipe, create a recipe, order those ingredients through the app, and then essentially hit go and the beer would be made. That's the first photo of an app, by the way. I mean, I was all over this. So about 6 months, for about 6 months I tried to rub elbows with these guys, tried to get to know them. I didn't know any of them. Got introductions, made sure it was the right parties, made sure the people were drinking my beer, was giving them to the right people, getting it past some people, only to find out that they were going to outsource this whole thing to a London firm. There'd be no story if that was actually true. To cut a long story short, it turned out that relationship fell apart, and I get an email about 6 months later saying that they've got $1 million of VC money and they're going to roll their own engineering team in Belfast, and when I come in and lead the firmware development. So I was like terrified at that point, and that's because reality had sort of set in, and I was like, who am I to do this? Like, I don't have a clue about running complex firmware projects. I've literally just been sitting in a cubicle ticking off Jira tickets with people telling me what to do for the last 4 or 5 years. But there's kind of this thing niggling in the back of your head, and I'm sure that as engineers you've all kind of felt it, like you kind of have to go and challenge yourself and kind of take that step. But I was very anxious, and I had what I think probably is imposter syndrome. I didn't really realize it at the time, and I sort of hesitated and dragged my heels. And in those guys' eyes, for some reason, they kept going on at me and really liked my ideas and wanted me to come in and do it. So I got invited one night. I got invited out to a company party just as they moved into Belfast, into their new office in Belfast, and I met a couple of guys who were going to stand to kind of like be quite high influencers to me as I spent my time at Brewbot. And the first one was this guy called George Thompson, who was this really, really big, gigantic, sort of jolly guy, and he'd worked at Boddington's for 30 years, and he was one of the top 10 sort of UK master brewers, and he had decided to come on board to kind of advise the company on recipe development and kind of actually the science of the brewing. And like speaking to him for one night, I learned more in that one night than I had learned in 3 years. Basically, I'm trying to do it by myself. But the second mentor, well, slightly different character. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Bebo, but Michael Birch, he was the founder of Bebo, and he sold it for almost $1 billion. And it turned out, for some mad reason, he was the lead VC investor in Brewbot. And he was the weirdest guy I've ever met. He lived in this mansion in San Francisco. He's over in Belfast. And he taught me sort of 3 things at that point. Not to really be afraid of risk, to jump in with 2 feet, and how to drink too much expensive champagne. He was sort of like a bit of a calculated madman, and I wasn't really sure if I liked him or loathed him when I met him. But anyway, I couldn't think of a single person like that at the company I was currently working at who was full of check shirts. So that's it. So the inevitable happened. I decided that this was an opportunity I just couldn't really not do. So a month later, handed in my notice, and a month later I walked into the new Brewbot office, which was quite a sight for me. Because gone was my cubicle and dress code now, and I walked out onto this wonderful bright mezzanine, which, believe it or not, was the floor above the entire bar that the company had just taken over as well. There were no set hours, no micromanagement, no calendars, just one job to do and lots of people to do it, and a really nice place to get it done. Next door, George had moved in a 200 litre brewery for the company to develop recipes on, and the best thing about it, 4 p.m. pints were no longer just a Friday treat. We just drank in the lab and we coded, and it was great. We had a lot of fun. And it was, like, you're all laughing, it was really bizarre for all of us. Whenever we started, one of the perks, we were given an unlimited bar tab. And after a couple of unruly nights at which a glass was thrown at my head in the lab, that was removed from us. But we were allowed £50 a weekend. So it wasn't a bad replacement. But just onto that brewery for a second. I mentioned the brewery. Myself and this guy Cody, he was the mechanical engineer at Brewbot. We were the only two real brewers on the team. And we just jumped on this brewery as soon as we got there. I learned how to use it. He joined me in learning how to use it. And basically we just started brewing all the time. We would bring our laptops into the lab and basically just code in there while we were brewing. And we quickly realised though that if you brew that often in a 200 litre system, you end up with like a lot of beer. So
200 litres.
So the logical step, we actually turned it into a licensed brewery, and we basically got the bar downstairs to cover all the cost of the ingredients and pay the tax bill, and then we gave them all of the beer to sell in the bar to help prop them up and sort of help generate some money for the bar. But the best thing is that we could make 10 kegs, mark one as wastage, and put that in the office on the tap, and then we would have a free keg of beer at the tap. It's really bizarre because I was still a firmware engineer, believe it or not, and it's just kind of a glorious time. But yeah, as I'm sure you're all aware, with all these peaks, there's inevitably some troughs, and the bigger the peak, the sort of deeper the trough can be, I guess, is what I wanted to say. As I crossed that threshold before into the startup world, I think I might have been wearing the rose-tinted glasses. The biggest problem of all was that we were 1 year after finishing the Kickstarter at this point, and the company actually didn't have anything. The entire 12 months they had failed to secure a good relationship with a contractor, with an outside shop to build this thing. And the whole thing had actually been smoke and mirrors. It was total vaporware. And like, as someone who considers themselves sort of an engineer with a bit of integrity, that was kind of hard for me to swallow, because I thought I was there to put this thing into production, not to do R&D. And all of a sudden we had 90 or 100 customers in Kickstarter who thought we were putting it into production, but in fact we were still at the very start of our R&D phase. But we had to develop, and we just had to get on with it, and that was kind of what we did. So I got some photos of their early stuff. The company didn't even have a fully functioning prototype when I started. The best we had was this kind of rat's nest of wires held together with some aluminium extrusion, and it was totally mad. So the first thing I did was sort of turn that into this box, which isn't much better. But quite frankly, I sort of looked at this one day and sort of almost had a panic attack, I think was the best way I can describe it. Because I was like used to people going in at 8 and leaving at 4 and working off Jira tickets. It's like I was all of a sudden kind of in this place where no one could make a decision. Some people worked 12 hours a day, some people worked 4 hours a day. I didn't know what time anybody started work at, and you just didn't know where anybody was at any given time. And all these inexperienced engineers running around this massive problem that no one could really solve. So a few slides back we talked about the process of brewing beer, and I kind of glossed over it quite fast, and I think I made it seem quite simple. But in fact, if like any engineer here, you'll realize if you start to look at a simple problem and start to break it down, it starts to become lots and lots of little tiny problems, and then those become lots and lots of little tiny problems. And this is kind of what happened with Brewbot. It just turned into like something that had so many little automated operations involved in it that it could just all go wrong at any given time. And the idea is like, if you fail in any one of these points, you have to be able to recover yourself, or be able to take the user through a simple recovery process. User experience, UX, I guess, and I'd never come across anything like this before, building a dumb sensor that sits in the back of a Volkswagen. So this was just completely mad. And all these problems aside, the biggest problem that I actually wanted to point out about the company was the problem of bad hiring, because it was mad. They had this crazy attitude, which I'm sure a lot of you are experienced with as well. And I mean no offense to grads when I talk about this, but they saw a grad as someone who was a third the cost of a senior engineer, and what they'd do is they'd hire 3 grads instead of hiring 1 senior expert. So now you've got 3 people just out of university, don't have a clue what they're doing, running around trying to build something that actually just needs a group of very experienced people to get stuck in. And then you have this end. We also had a problem with our engineering manager, I think that he was afraid to hire anyone smarter than him for some reason, and that just sort of like completely baffled me. So the team were floundering a bit at this point. I guess I was about 4 or 5 months into it, reaching around Halloween time, around this time, 2016. So I'll draw your attention to this part of the hero's journey because I've taken the quote from the actual framework. This is the part in which the hero must open his soul beyond terror, which sort of made me laugh, but then it really stressed me out because it reminded me about what was all to happen next. So we're around Halloween time, sort of coming close to November, December time, and this just wasn't working. We had to regroup, and we had to make some pretty hard decisions. So as I've hinted at, we had this problem with our engineering manager, and it just wasn't really working out. So what I realised quite early was that the software team had a pretty good idea what was going on. Yeah, go software. And I think that was just because we were breaking the problem down into very small problems and sort of working on it from that point of view. So we stayed up one night and we just stood in front of a whiteboard and said we're not leaving here until we have a plan for how to build this thing. But part of that plan was to get rid of the engineering manager. So we basically went to the CEO and we said, this isn't going to work if that guy's still around. And it was a pretty big move, but it actually worked. And basically, he managed to leave the company. We managed to take hold of it a little bit. We put a plan in place, and we decided that we're going to have to do this. We're going to have to get everybody behind this and get some ownership. And that's the only way that we're ever going to make this happen. So the hard part was that to get from this to what we considered a final product, was going to have to be about 4 months' work. But we had to ship this in 6 weeks. We had to ship 1 unit in 6 weeks, and that was the way to unlock our next part of VC funding. Was if our head investor, Michael Birch, got a unit in a month and a half. So we basically just sent everybody home at Christmas and said, enjoy yourselves because January's it's gone. It's a write-off. So the reason I put this setup again, same one from before, is just to kind of show you where we ended up in the middle of February. And we ended up here, second photo of an app. And we basically worked about 5 or 6 80-hour weeks. I didn't see my girlfriend for 6 to 8 weeks, and every time I seen my family, I knew there's a reason I brought you. And we boxed and we shipped that first brew bot February 9th, 2016, and that was really crucial for us, as I mentioned, to unlock the funding. That 5-week period was a really weird time. At the time we were just going 100 miles an hour and hadn't really thought about it, but the fallout afterwards was mentally kind of draining. When I'd see my family the odd time during that period, they just sort of looked at me with a horrified look on their face, like, why are you doing this to yourself? We were all psychologically, physically broken, and we'd all become like a family. We all kind of like loved each other and hated each other in equal measure, and it was just a weird time. So everyone basically put that in the back of the truck. We all just got our bags and we just left for 2 weeks, and we were just told not to come back for 2 weeks, basically. Like, shut ourselves down and regroup a little bit. And then come back, and we got to start getting this thing into production and getting this thing ready for its inevitable day 1 OTA software update. Towards the end of that period, it was payday, and when I was on my way to the office that morning, I went to buy some breakfast. I had to top up my Monzo card. Top up didn't work, and whenever I checked, I hadn't been paid, and basically the Slack was kind of blowing up. No one had been paid, and we all just got to the office, and everyone was kind of running around. There was no CEO, no office manager. Everyone was gone. And then the CEO manager popped up in Hangouts, and that was when the news came. There was no money left. No one was going to get paid, basically. So we all just kind of sat there a bit deflated, and half the team just got up, picked their bags and walked out, never to be seen again. And we don't really know what went wrong there. We think just pure negligence, quite frankly, but we didn't get paid that day, and as I mentioned, our team fell in half. We lost a lot of our front-end developers. We lost a mobile developer, we lost an electronic engineer that day, and the rest of us are just kind of sitting around going, I can't believe we put this much effort in to just walk away now. So what did I do? Well, I put 200 bottles of beer in 2 suitcases and I got on a plane to San Francisco. And basically, I went to Cody's house. So this is Cody's garage in San Francisco. And he, as I mentioned, is our mechanical engineer. And we just took the remaining money that we had and booked 2 flights out there. And we picked up the brewbot that we'd shipped there. And we basically stuck it on the back of a car. And we just drove around and demoed it to as many rich people and to as many tech meetups and to as many things as we could. And I stayed out there for probably about 2 months at the time. And I just slept on his sofa and we just tried our best with the CEO and the COO to basically try and pull this thing together and get some money. And it wasn't really going well. We had a lot of fun, a lot of good times, met a lot of really mad rich people, but we just never got anybody to bite. But in the very last week we did. We got a bite. One of our smallest backers decided to come in and for a little bit more. And the stipulation was that we had to meet very distinct targets over the next few months, and we were going to get drip fed the money. So semi-success, okay? So the most ridiculous part of this trip was going to kind of happen that night. The night before I left San Francisco, we were having a party in this garage just to kind of celebrate the success of raising the money that we needed. And a bit of playful banter, maybe it's the Northern Irish thing, I don't know. Our American CEO took it a little bit the wrong way, and we ended up in a very hot and heavy argument. And I basically ended up calling him a useless expletive deleted, and he fired me on the spot. So I sort of went, all right, well, fair enough, great. So I went to bed, got up the next morning, jumped on a plane, and flew back to Belfast. And I could sort of feel this wave of relief coming over me, just like, this is great, I don't have to do this madness anymore. And then I was picked up at the airport by the CEO, who told me that the COO no longer works at the company, and that I had to get back to the office right now. So I took one lesson away from that, which is that working software is more important than a COO, frankly. I wish it could say that things went well, but they didn't, and this is when things kind of got even murkier. So we're there working on the firmware, the app, the cloud, delivering OTA updates, and starting to ship 2 units every week. So we were hand building 2 units every week while fixing the broken code and while fixing the back end and refining the build process and trying to get this whole thing lined up. Because when you're going at 100 miles an hour for a month and a half, you realize that you actually don't have any process. And then we started to come back and try and develop that process. But then I realized the extent of our problem. So we didn't even have a supply chain. We didn't have any procurement set up. The people who were supposed to be doing this had just really dropped the ball. And frankly, we couldn't even make this thing for less money than we were selling it for. So we were making a loss in every single one of these. And I was just like, what is going on here? And I sort of felt a bit stupid at this point, like, how did I not notice this before? But I think that whenever you're so involved in a problem, like writing the firmware for something like this, you just miss that sort of stuff. You have to assume it in these kind of companies that things are being picked up by other people, but they're not always being picked up. So basically, at this point we had 30% of our customers demanding refunds, and 70% of the Kickstarter customers had set up a blog basically rubbishing the company at this point, and the CEO had just gone dark, gone quiet, no one could find him, no one could get hold of him. So I just felt super silly, and we all went in one day in June 2016 and basically got sat down in front of the webcam, and the CEO appeared. First time anyone's seen him in 2 weeks, and we just got told that we were being let go, and it was over basically. And we all just sort of looked at each other and didn't really say anything. We unplugged the webcam, we went downstairs to the safe, took all the petty cash, and we got a train to the beach, and we just lit a bonfire, and we just all sat around and got really drunk and tried to work out what we're going to do next with our lives basically. And it sort of taught me at that point that that was why it was really useful to have that good team, and it sort of made all that hard work and all that getting to know each other and becoming close with each other like worthwhile at this point. To come down from that experience, it was really hard because we'd spent 13 months working on this, and I wasn't sure I could actually go back to normal working and working for a normal company, because we were just having all this fun while we were also building something and just working kind of whenever we wanted. the day after what is known as the redundancy beach trip, this kind of sums up the Stockholm Syndrome that we all felt. I woke up the next morning and didn't really know what to do with myself. And I thought, well, I want to brew one last time on the 200 litre brewery before I leave this company. and I still had a key for the company, so I went down to the office to just brew with my headphones on by myself. But the mad thing is, when I got there, just all the other people were just kind of wandering around the office like zombies, not really knowing where to be or what to do. So the mad thing was, we just stayed up all night and we built all of the brewbot tech onto the big brewery, and sort of thought, like, why didn't we do this in the first place? This is a much better business model. Because we can make 200 litres. And if you notice the time, that's definitely not lunchtime. But I think, and this is something I wanted to talk about, was just I think there was a lot of embarrassment and shame around the room, because everyone kind of felt like they'd failed. And it was like a bad word almost to fail. But I pulled up a report, I don't have it with me, but I've got the quote from it. A recent CB Insights report showed that around 90% of new hardware startups fail. So like the stats were completely against us from the get-go. So even just to feel that bad was like, it was a bit silly, because we were sort of destined to fail from day one. We should have enjoyed this for what it was really, and not thought too much about the actual outcome. So I tried to consult for 2 months after that and tried to look into avenues about how I could actually go and study brewing in a more realistic sense, but with a mortgage banging on the door and 2 months salary in arrears, I just couldn't do it, so I had to find something new and put this whole experience behind me. Which led me to where I am today, so I decided the best thing for me was just to get up and leave Belfast, and one of my colleagues at Brewbot had worked remotely from Bristol, so I decided I'm going to move here. I saw a job advertisement in Dyson in the robotics department, and literally 9 days from that point later I had a job and was getting ready to move. And then a year after that I moved into IoT prototyping and connectivity research at Dyson, and now I'm kind of straddle that line between research and downstream development. And all that interviews and all that stuff that I did to get to that point, I sort of realised that all of the experience at Brewbot actually fed into that, and actually has made me kind of the engineer that I am today. And the ability to deal with the amount of stress and stuff that we had to deal with is actually like quite important. I did put together this slide because I've reflected a lot on startups and large companies recently, because quite close to finishing that experience I said I would never do it again, but now I'm sort of starting to get that itch again, where I think that I shouldn't be put off by that one bad experience. And I'm crap at Photoshop, by the way, but I put this graphic together basically, okay, which I think sums up companies, big companies and startups. Startups look really good from the outside, but often at the core they're terrible. Big companies look terrible from the outside, but often at the core they're quite good. And I think that they can stand to learn a lot from each other. I think that the things that startups do well, big companies can do better, and vice versa. The things that big companies do well, startups could stand to learn from very early in the process. But I kind of think that in the final stage of the journey, I'm now that kind of master of both worlds, and I'm able to look at a startup situation or a big company situation and kind of go, oh yeah, I can kind of navigate both of those situations now. And I think that if I was ever to do it again, I would know how to do it properly. But the main part of this is that I was able to detach my hobby from my job once more and come home at night and basically brew beer in my shed, which is what I do now. So that's kind of it. I hope that that was in some way enjoyable.